The Galactic Concord did not waste time. Within 2 days of Nathan Cole's admission, a special inquiry was announced. Ambassador Vythery made it very clear that this was not a trial. It was an investigation. The Concord simply wanted to understand what kind of species humanity was, and whether it posed a danger to the peace that the galaxy had maintained for thousands of years. Nathan accepted the terms without argument. He had no choice, and he knew it. The inquiry would be held aboard the Concord's Central Diplomatic Station, a massive ring-shaped structure that orbited a quiet star far from any claimed territory. It was neutral ground in every sense. No species owned it. No species controlled it. It belonged to the Concord itself, and within its walls, the word of the Assembly was law. Nathan Cole was asked to remain as the primary human representative. Grace Holloway and Peter Langston stayed with him. But Earth also sent a new addition to the team. Dr. Pearl, Karen Bishop, a professor of military history from one of the oldest universities on the planet. She was a small woman in her late 50s, with gray hair, sharp eyes, and a voice that could fill a room without ever being raised. She had spent her entire career studying war, not because she loved it, but because she believed that understanding it was the only way to prevent it. The inquiry panel was made up of 5 senior representatives from 5 different species. Vythery of the Soloon sat at the center. To his left was High Thinker Omnith of the Drayan, an insectoid species that operated as a collective mind. The Drayan did not think as individuals. Every thought, every feeling, every decision was shared across the entire species. The concept of one being raising a weapon against another was, to them, like a hand attacking its own body. It made no sense. To Vythery's right sat Arbiter Sulka of the Fenrath, a tall reptilian with dark green scales and golden eyes. The Fenrath were one of the few species in the Concord that had once been warlike. Long ago, they had fought brutal wars among themselves. But they had solved the problem in a way no human ever would. They had rewritten their own genetics, removing the instinct for aggression entirely. The remaining 2 panelists were a Velori diplomat known for her mathematical precision, and a Keth elder who rarely spoke, but listened with terrifying attention. The first phase of the inquiry was dedicated to facts. Karen Bishop was asked to present a broad history of human conflict. She stood before the panel with a simple display screen behind her, and spoke for 6 hours. She did not rush. She did not skip the uncomfortable parts. She began with the earliest known tribal conflicts, moved through the rise and fall of empires, and arrived at what she called the modern era, the age of industrialized warfare. She explained the First World War, how millions of young men had marched into trenches and died in mud for yards of ground that meant nothing. She explained the Second World War, how entire cities were burned from the sky, and how a single weapon, dropped from a single aircraft, killed over 100,000 people in a flash of light. She explained the Cold War that followed, how 2 nations had pointed enough nuclear weapons at each other to destroy the planet several times over, and how the only thing that stopped them from pressing the button was the knowledge that doing so would mean the end of everything. The delegates listened without interrupting. Their silence was heavy. Several of them had stopped taking notes. A few had visibly changed color, which among some species was a sign of deep distress. When Karen finished, Omnith was the first to speak. The Drayan's voice came through the translator as a low, steady hum. "You are telling us that your species built weapons capable of ending all life on your world. And then, instead of destroying those weapons, you built more of them." "Yes," Karen said. "And you continued to live alongside them. For generations." "Yes." "How?" Omnith asked, and the question was not rhetorical. The Drayan collective genuinely could not understand it. How does a species continue to function when it lives every day under the possibility of its own extinction? Karen thought for a moment. "We adapted," she said. "Humans are very good at adapting. We learned to live with the fear. We built systems to manage it. Treaties, alliances, early warning networks, diplomacy. We did not eliminate the threat, and we kept going. Arbiter Sulka leaned forward. Her golden eyes were fixed on Karen with an intensity that made Grace Holloway shift in her seat. Dr. Bishop, Sulka said, the Fenrath once faced a similar moment in our history. We had weapons that could destroy our world. We had factions that hated each other. We were on the edge of extinction, and we made a choice. We removed aggression from our biology. We cut it out of ourselves so that we could survive. She paused. Your species had the knowledge to do the same. You had the technology. Why did you not? Karen met her gaze steadily. Because we did not believe we could separate aggression from everything else it is connected to. What do you mean? I mean that in humans, the same instinct that drives a soldier to charge into battle is the same instinct that drives a parent to throw themselves in front of a car to save their child. The same fire that makes us fight is the same fire that makes us protect, create, build, and refuse to give up. We could not cut out the aggression without cutting out the courage. We could not remove the anger without removing the passion. And we decided, not once, but many times across our history, that the cost of removing those things was too high. The chamber was quiet. Sulka sat back slowly. She did not respond, but something shifted in her expression. It was small, barely visible, but Nathan Cole noticed it from across the room. It looked almost like recognition. Peter Langston leaned over to Nathan and whispered, I think she understands more than the others. Nathan nodded. She would. Her people made the opposite choice. She knows what it cost them. The inquiry continued for several more days. She explained military strategy, the rules of engagement, the Geneva Conventions, war crimes tribunals, and the concept of just war theory. She showed them that humans had not only studied how to fight wars, but had also spent centuries debating when it was right to fight them and how to hold themselves accountable when they crossed the line. Grace Holloway presented data on post-war recovery. She showed how nations that had been completely destroyed had rebuilt themselves within decades, often becoming stronger than they were before. She showed economic charts, population recovery data, and architectural records. Cities turned to rubble and then turned into centers of art and learning within a single generation. The delegates absorbed all of it, and with every new piece of information, the same unspoken question hung in the air, growing louder with each session. What kind of species survives all of this and still reaches for the stars? By the end of the first phase, no one on the panel had an answer. But Nathan Cole could see that the question itself had begun to change something in the room. Fear was still there, thick and obvious, but underneath it, so faint that most of the delegates probably did not even recognize it yet, was something else. It was curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of respect. The inquiry moved into its second phase, and this was the one the Concord had been waiting for. The facts were on the table. The history had been presented. Now the panel wanted to understand something much harder to explain. They wanted to understand why. Not just why humans fought, but why they kept fighting. Why they did not break. And why, in their darkest moments, they sometimes became something greater than they were in peacetime. Karen Bishop was given the floor for the full opening session. She stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by thousands of alien eyes, and she began with a story. She told them about a soldier during one of humanity's great wars. He was young, barely 20 years old, in a unit pinned down by enemy fire. A grenade landed in the middle of his squad. He had less than 2 seconds to react. He could have dived for cover. He could have frozen. Instead, he threw himself on top of it. The explosion killed him instantly. The 6 men around him survived. The chamber was completely still. "He was not special," Karen said quietly. "That is what I need you to understand. He was not a genetic exception. He was not trained to override his survival instinct through technology or conditioning. He was an ordinary young man from an ordinary town who, in the worst moment of his life, chose to die so that others could live." She paused and looked across the panel. "This is not a rare event in human history. We have thousands upon thousands of records like this. Soldiers who carried wounded strangers through gunfire, medics who ran toward explosions instead of away from them, pilots who stayed in their damaged aircraft to steer them away from cities full of people, knowing they would not survive the crash. Ordinary humans, afraid and hurting and exhausted, who chose someone else's life over their own." High Thinker Omnith's collective voice came through the translator slowly, almost hesitantly. "Dr. Bishop, in the Drayan Collective, self-sacrifice is impossible. Every individual is part of the whole. No single unit would die for another, because every unit is the other. Your species does not share a collective mind. Your individuals are separate. They feel pain independently. They die independently. And yet they choose to sacrifice themselves for beings who are, in biological terms, strangers." "Yes," Karen said. "That is the most frightening thing I have ever heard," Omnith said, and the translator carried the emotion perfectly. It was not anger, not disgust. It was awe, wrapped in something very close to fear. She explained the concept that humans called the warrior ethos, the unwritten code that had appeared in nearly every human culture throughout history. She described how warriors in ancient civilizations had lived by principles of honor, duty, and protection of the weak. She noted that these codes were not identical across cultures, but they shared a common core. The strong protect the weak. You do not abandon your companions. You face your fear and act anyway. She told them about the bonds that formed between soldiers in combat. She explained that humans who fought together often described their connection as something deeper than friendship, deeper even than family. They would cross oceans for each other. They would grieve for each other decades after the fighting ended. They would wake up in the middle of the night, old and gray, still reaching for someone who had died beside them 50 years ago. Grace Holloway then took the floor and shifted the focus. She wanted the panel to see what happened after the fighting stopped. She brought up images on the display. Cities reduced to nothing but ash and broken stone. Then she showed the same cities 10, 20, 30 years later. Streets rebuilt, buildings standing, children playing in parks where bombs had once fallen, factories running, schools open, music playing. "This is Berlin," Grace said, showing a city that had been nearly destroyed in one of humanity's worst wars. Within 20 years of the war's end, it was one of the most vibrant cultural cities on our planet. She showed another image. "This is Hiroshima. A single weapon killed tens of thousands of people here in an instant. Within a generation, it was a thriving city again. The people who survived did not leave. They stayed, they rebuilt, and they turned the site of their greatest tragedy into a monument for peace." The Valori diplomat on the panel, who had been silent until now, spoke for the first time. "You are showing us that destruction is not permanent for your species." "No," Grace said, "it is not. Humans break. We break all the time. But we put ourselves back together. Sometimes the rebuilt version is even stronger than the original." Arbiter Sulka had been watching the images with an expression that was hard to read. Her golden eyes moved slowly from one picture to the next. When Grace finished, Sulka asked a question that silenced the chamber. "My ancestors were warriors," she said. "The Fenrath fought terrible wars. We burned our own cities. We killed our own children. And when we could not bear it any longer, we changed ourselves. We removed the aggression. We removed the rage. We chose peace by cutting out the part of us that made war possible. She paused. But I will tell you something that is not in our official history. When we removed the aggression, we lost something else. We lost a kind of fire. A willingness to push beyond what was comfortable and safe. Our art became quieter. Our exploration slowed. Our people became content. But content is not the same as alive. She looked directly at Karen Bishop. You are telling me that your species stood at the same edge we did and chose not to jump? Yes, Karen said. We chose to keep all of it. The violence and the tenderness. The rage and the love. The destruction and the rebuilding. Because we believed, and we still believe, that you cannot have one without the other. Nathan Cole, who had been sitting quietly through the entire session, leaned forward. He had not planned to speak, but something in Sulka's words had reached a place inside him that he could not ignore. Every human being carries a war inside them, he said. Between who they are and who they want to be. Between their fear and their courage. Between the easy thing and the right thing. We do not always win that war. Sometimes we fail badly. But the fight itself, the refusal to stop trying, that is what makes us human. Take that away, and we are something else. Something quieter, maybe. Something safer. But not us. The chamber was silent for a very long time. Nathan could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. Some were afraid, some were confused, but a few, just a few, looked at him with something that was not fear or confusion at all. It was the look of someone seeing something they had forgotten they once had. Peter Langston noticed it too. He leaned over to Grace and said under his breath, I think some of them miss it. Grace did not answer, but she thought he might be right. The session ended without a formal conclusion. The panel retired to deliberate. But as the delegates filed out of the chamber, Nathan saw Arbiter Sulka standing near the exit, watching the humans with her golden eyes. She did not speak. She did not approach. But she gave Nathan a single slow nod before turning and walking away. It was a small gesture, but Nathan understood it. She was not afraid of them. She was mourning something her people had chosen to lose. The shift happened faster than Nathan Cole had expected. While the inquiry sessions had been difficult, they had also been fair. The panel had asked hard questions, but they had listened to the answers. For a few days, Nathan had allowed himself to believe that understanding might be enough. That if the Concord truly heard what humanity was, they might accept it. He was wrong. The proposal came from the Drayan Collective. It was formal, carefully worded, and devastating. The document called for the immediate quarantine of the human home system. All human vessels would be disabled or seized. Access to faster-than-light travel would be permanently revoked. Trade agreements would be cancelled. Communication channels would be restricted to emergency-only frequencies. Humanity would be sealed inside its own solar system, watched from a distance, and left alone until the Concord determined, if it ever did, that humans were safe enough to rejoin the galaxy. The justification was simple. A species that had not abandoned war was by definition a threat to galactic stability. The Concord had spent 6,000 years building a peaceful civilization. It could not afford to gamble that peace on the hope that a young, aggressive species would behave itself. The Drayan were not alone. Within hours of the proposal being circulated, it had the support of 11 species. The Fenrath backed it quietly, though Arbiter Sulka said nothing publicly. The Valori signed on with mathematical certainty, calculating the statistical risk of allowing an actively warlike species into the Concord, and finding it unacceptable. Even some of the smaller, quieter species, who had no personal experience with violence, supported the measure simply because the idea of war terrified them beyond reason. Ambassador Vathari told Nathan privately. He came to the human quarters aboard the Ardent Horizon late in the evening, his silver face drawn and tired. He sat across from Nathan in the small conference room and laid it out plainly. The quarantine proposal will go to a full vote of the Assembly within 3 days, Vathari said. As it stands, it has enough support to pass. Nathan sat very still. What happens if it passes? Your ship will be escorted back to your home system. A perimeter will be established. Any human vessel that attempts to cross it will be disabled. The quarantine will remain in effect indefinitely. Grace Holloway, standing near the door, felt her stomach drop. Indefinitely, she repeated. Until the Assembly votes to lift it, Vathari said. Which, given the current mood, could be centuries. Nathan looked at the ambassador for a long moment. Why are you telling us this? You could have let us hear it in the formal announcement. Vathari hesitated. It was the first time Nathan had ever seen the saloon diplomat look uncertain. Because I have spent the last several days listening to your people describe what you are, he said. And I am not yet convinced that locking you away is the right answer. But I am one voice, Captain Cole. And right now, the fear in this station is louder than any single voice. After Vathari left, Nathan gathered his team. The 4 of them sat in the conference room, Nathan, Grace, Peter, and Karen, and the silence between them was thick. Peter Langston spoke first. We cannot fight our way out of this. We have one ship, they have a fleet that could turn our entire solar system into a parking lot. No one is talking about fighting, Nathan said. We need to talk. We need to make them listen. They have been listening, Karen said. That is the problem. They listened to everything I told them about our history, and it scared them half to death. You cannot argue someone out of fear, Nathan. Fear does not respond to logic. Grace leaned forward. Then what does it respond to? Karen thought about it. Something stronger. Something that makes the fear feel small. Nathan stood up and walked to the viewport. The stars outside were cold and distant. Somewhere among them was Earth, a tiny blue dot that had no idea its entire future in the galaxy was being decided by strangers who had never set foot on its soil. I want to address the full assembly, Nathan said. Peter raised an eyebrow. The full assembly, all of them, every species. Yes. And say what exactly? Nathan turned from the viewport. The truth, not our history. The truth about what we are and why they need us. Karen studied him carefully. That is a dangerous approach. If you push too hard, you will confirm every fear they already have. And if I do not push at all, they lock us in a box and throw away the key, Nathan said. I would rather take the risk. Grace nodded slowly. I agree, but you need to understand something, Nathan. You will be standing in front of thousands of delegates who have already made up their minds. Most of them will not be listening to hear what you say. They will be listening to confirm what they already believe. Then I will have to say something they do not expect, Nathan said. He sent a formal request to the Assembly for an emergency address. It was granted, though the message that came back made it clear that several delegations considered it nothing more than a courtesy before the inevitable vote. They were letting him speak because the rules required it, not because they expected it to change anything. The night before the address, Nathan could not sleep. He walked through the corridors of the ardent horizon, past the crew quarters where a handful of human officers slept uneasily, past the engine room where the hum of the ship's systems was the only sound, and up to the observation deck at the top of the vessel. He stood there alone, looking out at the stars. He thought about his daughter back on Earth, 7 years old, who had asked him before he left if he was going to find aliens. He had laughed and said maybe. She had told him to be nice to them. He thought about his grandfather, who had fought in a war and come home with a limp and nightmares that never fully went away. The old man had never talked about what he did during the war, but once, late at night, he had told Nathan something that stuck with him forever. Being brave does not mean you are not scared, his grandfather had said. It means you are scared, and you do the thing anyway. Grace found him on the observation deck sometime after midnight. She stood beside him and looked out at the same stars. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Nathan almost laughed. "More than I have ever been in my life." "Good," Grace said. "That means you are paying attention." He looked at her. "What if it doesn't work? What if I say everything I have and they still vote to lock us away?" Grace was quiet for a moment. "Then at least they will know who we are. And one day, when they need us, they will remember." Nathan nodded. He did not sleep that night. He sat on the observation deck and watched the stars turn, and he thought about every war humanity had ever fought, every city they had ever rebuilt, every time they had been knocked to the ground and gotten back up again. He did not prepare notes. He decided that when the time came, he would stand in front of the galaxy and speak from the only place that mattered, the place where fear and courage lived side by side. The grand chamber of the Galactic Concord was the largest enclosed space Nathan Cole had ever seen. It rose in sweeping tiers from a central platform, every level packed with delegates from every known spacefaring species in the galaxy. Thousands of eyes, some with pupils, some without, some glowing faintly in the dim light of the chamber, all turned toward the single figure who walked to the podium at the center. Nathan wore no uniform. He carried no weapon and no notes. He had not slept. His eyes were tired, and his hands were steady. And when he reached the podium, he stood there for a moment and simply looked at the assembly. He let them see him, not as a representative, not as a captain, but as a man standing alone in front of a galaxy that was afraid of his kind. He began quietly. "You are afraid of us," he said. "I want you to know that I understand it, because I think understanding is where everything important begins." His voice carried clearly through the translation matrix. Every species heard him in their own language, and every species heard the same calm, steady tone. "You have read our history. You have seen what we have done to each other, the wars, the weapons, the destruction. You have seen cities turn to rubble, and fields turn to graves. You have heard about bombs that can erase 100,000 lives in a single heartbeat. And you are right to be disturbed by it. We are disturbed by it too." He paused and let the words settle. "We carry that history with us every single day. It is in our monuments and our museums and our songs. It is in the scars on our land and the sadness in our stories. Every generation of humans grows up learning what the generation before it did wrong, and every generation swears it will do better. Sometimes we succeed. Sometimes we fail, but we never stop trying." A low murmur passed through the upper tiers. Nathan waited for it to fade. "You have built something remarkable here," he continued. 6,000 years of peace, 40 species, living and working together without war. That is an extraordinary achievement, and I mean that with complete sincerity. But I want to ask you something, and I ask it with respect." He looked up at the highest tier, where the oldest and most powerful delegations sat. "In all those 6,000 years, have you ever been tested?" The murmur stopped. Not by disease, not by natural disaster, not by economic collapse. Have you ever been tested by something that wanted to destroy you? Something that looked at everything you had built and decided to tear it apart? An enemy that did not care about your treaties, or your laws, or your principles? Silence. We have faced that enemy more times than I can count. Sometimes that enemy came from across an ocean. Sometimes it came from across a border. Sometimes it looked back at us from the mirror. And every single time, we fought it. Not because we are violent by nature, not because we enjoy suffering, but because we love what we are protecting more than we fear what we are facing. He stepped slightly forward, away from the podium, closer to the assembly. You want to quarantine us. You want to lock us inside our solar system and keep us away from the rest of the galaxy. Because you are afraid of what we might do. I am not going to stand here and tell you that your fear is wrong. It is not wrong. We are dangerous. We know that better than anyone. He paused again. His voice dropped lower, and somehow it became even more powerful. But I want you to consider something. You abandoned war because you were afraid of it. You looked at violence and decided the safest thing to do was to remove it from yourselves entirely. And in doing so, you created a galaxy that has never had to fight for its survival. A galaxy that has never been tested. A galaxy that does not know what it will do when something truly terrible arrives at its doorstep. He looked at Arbiter Sulka. She was watching him with her golden eyes, perfectly still. You suppressed your aggression because you feared it, he said to her directly. But aggression is not the same thing as cruelty. They are not the same. Sometimes aggression is a mother standing over her child. Sometimes it is a stranger running into a burning building. Sometimes it is a soldier standing in a gap in the wall because someone has to, and he is the only one left. Sulka did not look away. Nathan turned back to the full assembly. Every species in this room chose to survive by becoming less aggressive, less dangerous, less capable of violence. And it worked. For 6,000 years, it worked. But the galaxy is a very big place, and peace does not last forever. One day, something will come that does not care about your concord, or your treaties, or your 6,000 years of quiet. His voice was steady and clear. And when that day comes, you will need allies who know what it means to fight, not because they love it, because they have done it before, because they have been knocked down and gotten back up, because they have looked into the worst thing their world had to offer and said, not today. He took a breath. The chamber was so quiet that the sound of his breathing carried to the upper tiers. We are not asking you to trust us because we are safe, Nathan said. We are not safe. We have never been safe. We are asking you to trust us because we are brave. Because we have survived everything our world and our history have thrown at us, and we are still here. Still reaching for the stars. Still hoping that the next generation will be better than the last. He straightened and looked at the assembly one final time. You can lock us away. You can seal us in our system and pretend we do not exist. But you will not be locking away a threat. You will be locking away the only species in this galaxy that knows how to stand in the fire and not run. He stepped back from the podium. He said nothing else. He simply stood there, a single human being in a room full of beings who had spent millennia running from exactly what he represented. The silence lasted a very long time. Then, Ambassador Vathari rose from his seat. He looked at Nathan Cole with an expression that carried the weight of a decision that could not be undone. Then he turned to the assembly. I move to table the quarantine proposal, Vathari said, and to open formal membership negotiations with the human delegation. The vote was not immediate. There were murmurs, objections, frantic whispered conversations between delegates. Several species demanded more time. The Drayan protested formally. But when the vote was called, it passed. Not by a wide margin, not unanimously, but it passed. Humanity would not be quarantined. Humanity would be welcomed into the Galactic Concord, cautiously, nervously, and with a level of attention that no new species had ever received before. Nathan walked out of the grand chamber with Grace Holloway beside him. His legs were shaking slightly, though he did not let it show. Grace noticed anyway. You did it, she said. We did it, he said. All of us. Peter Langston met them in the corridor with a rare, full smile on his face. Karen Bishop was already on a communication channel with Earth, delivering the news. As they walked back to the ardent horizon, Nathan passed Arbiter Sulka in the hallway. She stopped. They stood, facing each other for a moment. "Your grandfather," Sulka said. "The one who told you about being brave." Nathan blinked. He had never mentioned his grandfather publicly. Then he remembered. Sulka had been listening when he spoke to Grace on the observation deck. The station had ears everywhere. "He was right," Sulka said simply. Then she walked away. In the years that followed, humanity proved itself many times over. They were noisy and complicated and sometimes infuriating. They argued and debated and pushed boundaries that other species preferred to leave untouched. But they also built things. They created art that made the saloon weep. They developed medical techniques that saved millions of alien lives. They explored regions of space that no other species had dared to enter. And when the threat came, when something vast and hungry and utterly without mercy emerged from the dark spaces between the stars, it was the humans who stepped forward first. Not because they were not afraid. They were terrified, every last one of them. But they had learned, a long, long time ago, that fear was not a reason to stop. It was a reason to stand up. The Galactic Concord had existed for nearly 6,000 years. It was a council of over 40 spacefaring species, each one ancient, each one proud, and each one bound by the same sacred principle: peace above all else. War, to these species, was something from the distant past. It was a memory buried under centuries of progress, spoken of the same way a grown adult might speak of childhood nightmares. It had been real once, yes, but it was over now. Every civilized species in the known galaxy had left violence behind a long time ago. So, when a new species appeared on the edge of the Milky Way, transmitting signals from a small blue world orbiting an ordinary yellow star, the Concord responded the way it always did. It sent a diplomatic envoy. The envoy was led by Ambassador Vathari, a tall, silver-skinned being from the Saloon race. The Saloon were known across the galaxy for their patience and their calm. They had brokered more peace agreements than any other species in the Concord, and Vathari himself had spent 300 years in diplomatic service. He had met new species before. He was not worried. The human delegation arrived aboard a deep space vessel called the Ardent Horizon. It was not a large ship by galactic standards, but it was well-built, clean, and functional. The humans who stepped off it were shorter than most species Vathari had met, soft-skinned, and surprisingly warm in their greetings. Their leader was Captain Nathan Cole, a broad-shouldered man with steady eyes and a firm handshake. With him were Lieutenant Grace Holloway, his communications officer, and a civilian cultural advisor named Peter Langston. The first meetings went well. Nathan Cole was polite and direct. Grace Holloway was sharp and observant. Peter Langston had a gift for putting alien delegates at ease with his quiet humor and genuine curiosity. Trade proposals were discussed. Star maps were exchanged. The humans seemed eager to learn and willing to share. Several delegates privately remarked that this new species was remarkably pleasant. On the fourth day, a routine cultural exchange session was held. This was standard procedure for new species entering the Concord. A senior historian from the Saloon named Dreth Valo was assigned to lead the session. His job was simple: gather a broad understanding of the new species and their development so the Concord could place them within the galactic record. Dreth Valo began with the usual questions. He asked about their homeworld, their biology, their social structures, and their technology. The humans answered everything openly and without hesitation. Then Dreth Valo reached the section of his questionnaire that he had never once found interesting in all his years of work, because every species answered it the same way. "We would like to understand your species' relationship with conflict," he said through the translation matrix. Specifically, at what point in your development did your kind abandon war? Grace Holloway stopped mid-sentence. Peter Langston set down the datapad he had been holding. Nathan Cole looked at Dreth Valo for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes. It was not anger. It was not shame. It was something the alien historian could not identify. We haven't, Nathan said. Dreth Valo tilted his head. His 4 silver eyes blinked in sequence. I apologize. I believe the translation matrix may have made an error. Could you repeat your answer? There was no error, Nathan said. Humans have not abandoned war. It was not the kind of stillness that comes from surprise. It was the kind that comes from something deeper. The sudden realization that the ground beneath you is not as solid as you thought. 43 delegates from 19 different species sat in their seats and did not move. Dreth Valo looked at his datapad, then back at Nathan. You are saying that your species, which has developed faster than light travel, advanced medicine, and artificial intelligence, still engages in organized armed conflict? Yes, Nathan said. How recently? Dreth asked. Nathan glanced at Grace, then back at the historian. Our last major conflict ended about 60 years ago. There have been smaller ones since. A murmur passed through the chamber. It was quiet, but it carried a weight that Nathan could feel, even without understanding the alien languages being whispered around him. He saw delegates leaning toward each other, their eyes wide, their movements sharp and nervous. Ambassador Vathari raised a hand, and the murmur stopped. He looked at Nathan with an expression that was difficult to read. Captain Cole, he said slowly, are you telling this assembly that war is a continuing feature of human civilization? Not a relic of your past, but an active part of your present? I am, Nathan said. He did not look away. He did not apologize. He simply answered the question as honestly as he knew how. And your species is not afraid of this? Vathari asked. Nathan thought about the question for a moment. He thought about the history books he had read as a boy, about the war memorials he had visited, about the stories his grandfather had told him late at night when the old man could not sleep. He thought about the weight of those stories, and the sadness in them, and the strange, unbreakable pride that ran underneath, like a river. We are afraid, Nathan said. We have always been afraid, but we do not let fear stop us from doing what needs to be done. Vathari stared at him for a long time. Then he turned to the assembly and announced that the session was adjourned. Emergency communications were sent out across every diplomatic channel in the Concord. A message was short, and it spread fast. Within hours, every species in the galaxy had heard the same words. The new species still wages war, and they do not appear to be afraid of it. Nathan Cole and his team were escorted back to their quarters aboard the Ardent Horizon. No one spoke to them on the way. The corridors of the diplomatic station, which had been warm and welcoming just that morning, now felt cold and distant. Doors that had been open were closed. Delegates who had smiled at them the day before turned away as they passed. Grace Holloway walked beside Nathan in silence for a while, then said quietly, "That could have gone better." Nathan almost smiled. They asked a question. I gave them an honest answer. "I know," Grace said. "That is what worries me." Peter Langston, walking a few steps behind, looked out through a viewport at the vast emptiness of space. Somewhere out there, billions of light years away, was Earth, a small world full of noisy, stubborn, complicated people who had been fighting and rebuilding and fighting again since the very beginning of their history. He wondered if the galaxy was ready for that. He suspected it was not.